Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
For years, no, for decades, I learned how to be quiet about my disappointment, how to nod and smile when the family group chat exploded with plans and photos for someone else's birthday, usually my brother's, usually Ryan's, with cakes and banners and some theme that my mother swore she threw together last minute, even though there were matching shirts, a playlist, and a goddamn personalized Snapchat filter. I sat through it all, year after year, with a polite thumbs up on the photos, sometimes even offering a "looks fun" just to play the part. Then, when my birthday rolled around, always January 2nd, tucked right behind the holidays, when everyone was broke, tired, hungover, and vaguely resentful to still be around family, I'd get a text. Sometimes not even that. One year, I got a HBD from Ryan. Just the letters. That was it. I stared at it for 20 minutes wondering if I should say thank you or if that would just make me seem pathetic. I said nothing. You'd think I would have gotten used to it. And I did, sort of. After all, I was the oldest. The one who stayed close when Dad got sick. The one who gave up college out of state because Mom couldn't manage everything on her own. The one who worked weekends to help pay for Ryan's cross-country soccer tournaments. The one who made sure Nana got her medication when no one else remembered she had a doctor's appointment. The one who didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, didn't even cry when Dad died, and Ryan, who hadn't visited him in over 8 months, got up at the funeral and gave a speech like he was some kind of war hero returning from battle. But this year, something inside me quietly, without announcement or drama, just broke off. Not with a bang, not even with a tear. It was like a light in a room flickering for the last time before it dies out. My phone buzzed at 7:43 a.m. on my birthday. One message from the group chat. A sticker of a cupcake. From Aunt Carol. No text, no "Happy birthday, Laura." Not even a damn emoji. I stared at it, the pathetic digital frosting slowly loading, and then, without hesitation, I deleted the chat. Not muted. Not archived. Deleted. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't ask for advice or compare Airbnb listings or tell my coworkers I needed a break. I just packed a small duffel bag, grabbed my snow boots, got in my 15-year-old Subaru, and drove north. For almost 6 hours, I didn't listen to music. No podcasts. Just the sound of tires humming against ice-dusted asphalt and the wind slipping past the windows like whispers I didn't care to decipher. Somewhere outside of Rangeley, Maine, past a few ice fishing shacks and one too many moose crossing signs, I pulled into a long gravel driveway and saw it, the cabin. Now, when I say dream cabin, I don't mean some HGTV log palace with antler chandeliers and granite countertops. I mean my dream. My version. 2 bedrooms, real wood-burning stove, wraparound porch, and most importantly, a balcony that looked out over a frozen lake, framed by pines that sighed when the wind pushed through them like they were exhaling secrets. It was already mine. I'd been saving for years, quietly, in a separate account my family didn't know about. No one knew I even wanted a place like this, because I'd learned early not to share my dreams. That way, they couldn't be mocked, ignored, or postponed until things settled down, which in my family meant never. The woman who sold it to me was in her 60s and smelled like peppermint and wood varnish. She didn't ask many questions. Just handed me the keys, gave me the best tips on keeping pipes from freezing, and told me with a wink, "Nothing here moves fast, including gossip." I liked that. It felt like a place where my past couldn't catch up. That first night, I didn't cry. I thought I might. I thought I'd have a dramatic, cinematic moment, curled on the couch with a bottle of red wine and my loneliness finally catching up with me in some elegant, painful collapse. But no. I lit the stove, made a grilled cheese sandwich, wrapped myself in a blanket older than my car, and just stared out that massive window toward the black, frozen stillness beyond the balcony. It wasn't loneliness I felt, it was space. Space for the first time in my life. I went to sleep without checking my phone. When I woke up, the sun was barely touching the tops of the trees. I stepped out onto the balcony with a mug of coffee, my breath clouding in the crisp air. I looked out at the view, soft blue shadows across white snow, little dots of movement where birds hopped along the branches. It hit me then, quietly and with a strange kind of joy, that no one knew where I was. No one had called. No one had noticed I was gone. And I didn't care. But later that afternoon, while I was cleaning up the kitchen and laughing to myself about how badly I'd burned the grilled cheese the night before, a wild thought entered my head. Not wild like reckless, but wild like petty. A little seed of mischief I hadn't indulged in for years. I picked up my phone, still in airplane mode, snapped a photo of the view from the balcony, made sure it caught the railing, the snow, and just the hint of my coffee mug on the edge of the frame. No caption. No hashtags. Just the view. Then I switched airplane mode off, scrolled to the group chat, and dropped it in. And that right there, that tiny digital act of rebellion, is when everything started to unravel. The truth is, Ryan was never just my younger brother. He was the center of gravity around which our entire family spun, the sun to which everyone turned their face, always warm, always smiling, always just charming enough to make you forget that someone else might be standing in the shadow of all that light, and for as long as I can remember, that someone was me. I used to think it was just the way things were, that every family had a favorite, and it was no one's fault that the golden child got the parties and the parades while the older sibling got chores and expectations, and the occasional half-hearted "you're so responsible, Laura." But the older I got, the more I started to understand that this wasn't just favoritism, it was something deeper, a family-wide hypnosis that left everyone believing Ryan was special simply because he never had to be anything else. When we were kids, birthdays were the clearest indication of where we each stood. Ryan's parties were the kind of over-the-top affairs you'd see in Hallmark movies, jump castles in the backyard, a magician once, face painters, water slides, one year even a rented llama, because he saw it on a TV show and made a joke about it. And suddenly Mom was calling farms in neighboring counties like it was a mission from God. Meanwhile, my birthdays often slipped into that awkward space between New Year's Day hangovers and people going back to work, and even when I was little, I could see the difference. My parties, if they happened at all, were held in the kitchen, with a small sheet cake from the grocery store bakery and a handful of cousins who were still in town and had nothing better to do. The only balloons were usually leftovers from New Year's, the kind with streamers and champagne bottles on them, which felt hilariously inappropriate for a 6-year-old, but no one seemed to notice or care. I spent most of my childhood learning how to be helpful, how to disappear at just the right moments, how to be the extra pair of hands that cleaned up after Ryan's birthday messes or kept Nana company when Mom was too tired to deal with her. I knew how to load the dishwasher before I was 10, how to write thank you notes for gifts I didn't remember receiving, how to fake a smile when relatives gushed about how adorable Ryan was, as if I were just some extra in a sitcom they barely noticed. I figured if I was good enough, useful enough, maybe someone would one day throw me a party just because they wanted to, not because they felt obligated. But that day never came. Even as adults, the pattern didn't change. Ryan, with his easy charm and permatan and that vague, well-paying job in marketing that no one fully understood, remained the focal point of every gathering. Every family event seemed to orbit around his schedule, his relationships, his needs. When he broke up with his girlfriend of 3 years, the entire family went into crisis mode, rallying around him with casseroles and inspirational quotes about healing. When I got divorced after 16 years of marriage to a man who slowly drained every ounce of joy out of me, the most I got was a slightly awkward hug from Aunt Carol and a passive-aggressive comment from my mother about how these things happen when women stop trying. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing, not really. Not in the way people ask when they truly want to know. It was as if my pain was a private inconvenience, while Ryan's was a communal event. I remember one year, I must have been 32, when Ryan's birthday happened to fall on a Sunday, and the family threw him a surprise brunch at this trendy spot downtown. Everyone was there. There were decorations, custom menus with his name printed on them, even little party favors with miniature bottles of whiskey, because Ryan loves his bourbon. I remember sitting there, wedged between 2 second cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, watching as he opened gift after gift, each one met with laughter and cheers, while I smiled politely and sipped lukewarm coffee. At some point, my mother leaned over and whispered, "See how happy he is? That's what matters, isn't it?" I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do, scream in the middle of the restaurant that it wasn't fair, that I had never once been made to feel this special, not even as a child. Over time, I started to stop expecting anything. Not just on birthdays, but in general. I learned how to pre-write my own birthday messages to others, so no one could accuse me of being distant or ungrateful. I sent flowers when people got promoted, even if no one noticed my own accomplishments. I learned how to become invisible with grace, how to absorb every small slight and swallow every unfairness with a smile, until my entire sense of worth was tied up in how little trouble I could cause. And I did it well, too well, probably, because no one ever suspected that under the quiet, agreeable surface, something bitter was slowly growing, curling in on itself like smoke in a sealed jar. So when this year rolled around and I got that cupcake sticker from Aunt Carol and nothing else, not even the perfunctory, "Have a good one," from my mother, I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I didn't call anyone to ask why they'd forgotten. I just stared at that meaningless little sticker, all bright colors and cartoon frosting, and I felt something shift, like a lever being pulled inside me that couldn't be undone. That was the moment I realized I was done waiting for someone else to celebrate me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply done. I think people imagine revenge as something loud and messy, something with shouting and slamming doors and cutting people off. But sometimes revenge is quiet. Sometimes it's deleting a group chat without saying a word. Sometimes it's buying a cabin in the middle of nowhere and lighting a fire in the hearth and sipping coffee while the world goes on, unaware that they've just lost you. That's how it was for me. The quiet kind. The kind no one saw coming. But they would. Soon. There's something disturbingly satisfying about watching people scramble to make sense of a silence they helped create, something almost therapeutic in offering them nothing but a mirror and letting them squirm in their own discomfort. And that's exactly what I did when I sent the photo, the single, uncaptioned photo, to the family group chat, which had spent the last several months orbiting entirely around Ryan's birthday plans, Ryan's new girlfriend, Ryan's new car, and some vague notion of a beach house he might or might not invest in if things lined up right, though no one ever asked what exactly those things were or how they were lining up, because no one ever pressed Ryan for details. They just nodded, smiled, and clapped like trained seals at whatever dream he was chasing that month. So when I snapped that picture framed just right, with the steaming mug of coffee perched on the railing of the balcony, the early morning sunlight glinting off the untouched snow below, and the jagged silhouette of the pines casting long shadows across the frozen lake, I didn't think twice. I didn't add a message, a greeting, or even a passive-aggressive, "Happy Monday." I simply posted the image and turned off my phone, not because I was afraid of what they'd say, but because I already knew. When I turned it back on several hours later, after splitting firewood for the first time in my life and laughing out loud when I nearly dropped the axe on my own foot, I saw the little red numbers stacked on my screen like warning lights. 27 missed messages in under 40 minutes, all stemming from a photo that, at face value, said absolutely nothing. And yet, somehow, it said everything. The first response came from my mother, of course, who never once asked me how I was doing during my divorce, never noticed when I stopped showing up to Sunday dinners, never even remembered which city I was living in during my last job change. And yet suddenly, upon seeing a snowy forest view from a cabin she didn't recognize, she found herself brimming with urgency and concern. "Where are you?" was all she wrote, followed quickly by, "Is this a vacation?" And then, as if catching herself too late, "Are you alone?" What followed was a strange, unraveling sort of digital chaos, the kind where no one really says what they're thinking, but everyone is trying to get to the same unsettling point, only they don't want to admit that the real reason they're spiraling is because, for the first time, I had done something significant without telling them. Ryan chimed in with his usual brand of performative concern disguised as judgment, writing, "Kinda weird you'd post a cryptic photo in the middle of nowhere and not explain anything," followed almost immediately by, "Is everything okay?" and then laughably, "You're not in trouble or something, right?" I didn't reply. I sat there, barefoot in thick socks, sipping black coffee, watching my family try to connect dots I had never given them permission to see, and I felt, more than anything, free. It was Aunt Carol, always the one to stir the pot just enough without being the one to clean up afterward, who finally said what everyone else was too afraid to voice directly. "Looks like someone finally got tired of being forgotten," she wrote, and it landed like a grenade in the middle of the group. There were a few awkward reactions, that weird little digital laugh with no actual laughter behind it, followed by an eerie silence where no one quite knew what to say. As if someone had just pointed out that the emperor had no clothes and everyone was stuck pretending they hadn't noticed all along. I watched the messages stack up, watched the desperate tone creep in beneath the attempts to remain lighthearted, watched my mother pivot from passive concern to full-blown guilt-tripping in under 5 minutes. "I just think it's strange you'd go somewhere alone and not mention it to anyone. We're family, Laura. We care. We worry," as if her entire identity as a caring mother was suddenly on trial, and all because I had the audacity to claim joy in solitude. And the best part? I said nothing. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't soften the blow. I didn't reassure them that I was fine, or that it was just a short trip, or that I'd be back in time for Easter brunch. I left them exactly where they had left me, countless times over the years, uncertain, overlooked, and desperately guessing. Later that evening, as the sky turned to a deep indigo and the frost crept along the windows in delicate webs of crystal, I found myself laughing, not the bitter, tight-chested kind of laugh that comes from years of swallowing your feelings, but a genuine, belly-deep laugh that felt like it was shaking something loose inside me. It was funny, in a tragic kind of way, how a simple photo could do what years of explaining never could. All my attempts to communicate, to connect, to ask for the bare minimum of attention or acknowledgement had fallen on deaf ears, and yet the absence of words, the act of saying absolutely nothing, had finally gotten their attention. What no one in that group chat seemed to understand, or was willing to admit, was that this wasn't about the cabin, or the view, or the lack of a caption. This was about the fact that I had made a decision entirely for myself, without consulting them, without inviting their opinions or waiting for permission. And that terrified them. Because if I could do this, if I could disappear into the woods and find happiness on my own, what else was I capable of doing without them? What else might I have already done? I didn't respond that night. I didn't respond the next morning either. I let the messages sit there, unanswered, piling up like unread voicemails from a job you no longer care about. I went outside and shoveled a path from the porch to the woodshed, made myself oatmeal with too much cinnamon, and read a book I hadn't touched in years. I watched the trees sway in the wind like they were waving hello, or maybe goodbye, and I thought about how strange it was that in just one day, I had reclaimed something I hadn't even realized was missing, my own presence in my life. They could keep guessing. They could keep squirming. Let them. The view was better from here. There's a very particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from confrontation or shouting matches or explosive declarations, but from the quiet, deliberate refusal to participate in the same dysfunctional dance that's played out for years. And as I stood in that cabin, surrounded by the silence of snow-blanketed forest and the smell of burning pine logs crackling in the wood stove, I realized that my revenge, the real kind, the kind that gets under skin and lingers long after the shouting, would have faded, wasn't going to be loud or theatrical or even immediately visible to anyone but me. It was going to be still, cold, calculated, and most of all, completely mine. After the chaos in the group chat began to die down, not because they'd moved on, but because they didn't know what else to say without a response from me, I began to sense the shift, subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm. When people start to realize that you're not playing your usual role anymore. For decades, I had been the buffer, the peacemaker, the reliable one who responded quickly and rarely asked for anything, the one who could be counted on to show up on time, remember birthdays, send thank you notes, and keep her emotions quiet enough not to disturb anyone else's carefully curated sense of family harmony. But something had unspooled inside me in the weeks before I arrived at the cabin, something old and unspoken that had finally decided it didn't want to play dead anymore. I spent my days chopping wood, rearranging furniture, and learning the rhythms of a house that didn't care whether I was efficient or agreeable or emotionally available. I fixed a crooked cabinet door with a screwdriver I hadn't touched in 5 years. I cleaned windows so thoroughly that when the morning sun hit the glass just right, it felt like the world outside was bleeding into the living room, and I began writing again. Something I hadn't done since I was in college, and some well-meaning professor suggested that maybe my stories were too quiet to matter. Turns out, quiet stories are exactly the ones people remember when the noise dies down. And then, 3 days after the photo, I got the call. It wasn't from my mother, who had been sending strings of passive-aggressive texts phrased like questions, but meant as accusations. Just wondering if you're planning to come back before your cousin's bridal shower, or hope everything's okay. Though it'd be nice if you'd let someone know, and it wasn't from Aunt Carol, who had gone ominously silent after her not-so-subtle observation blew up the group chat. No, it was from Ryan. Of course it was. His voice on the other end of the line was casual, too casual, like someone trying to pretend they weren't standing on a trapdoor, waiting to see if it would give way. He started with a joke, something about how I'd gone full mountain woman and should probably let someone know before disappearing into the woods, as though this whole thing was just another one of my quirky overreactions. I said nothing, let him keep talking, let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable, and when he finally cleared his throat and said, "So, seriously, where are you?" I responded with the truth, but not the version he wanted. "I'm somewhere that feels like mine," I said, calmly, clearly, without the usual twinge of apology that always slipped into my voice when I talked to him. "And I'm not sure yet if I want to come back." There was a pause. A real one this time. Not the kind where he's thinking of a clever response or mentally checking his calendar to see if he can fit me into his afternoon, but the kind where he finally realized I meant every word. That night, I invited someone up. It wasn't spontaneous, and it wasn't romantic, though I'm sure the family would have loved to believe it was, because nothing makes people more comfortable than the idea that a woman only reclaims her life when there's a man involved. But this wasn't about comfort. This was about history. I called David, yes, that David, the boy I almost married before I married the one who seemed like a safer bet, the one who looked good on paper, the one my family approved of because he was steady and successful and, as my mother put it at the time, not some small-town wanderer. David and I hadn't spoken in years, not since the last time I saw him at a funeral, and we exchanged a smile that said everything we weren't allowed to say out loud, but I'd kept his number. And when I sent him a photo of the view from my balcony and asked if he wanted to see it in person, he replied with just 4 words, "Name the damn day." When he showed up, 2 days later, with snow in his beard and a 6-pack of the dark beer we used to drink in college, I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel flustered or self-conscious or worried about how it would look to anyone else. I felt grounded. Like maybe this version of me, the one who cooked dinner in socks and flannel, the one who didn't wear makeup for a week, the one who let herself want something without asking permission, was the one I was always meant to be. We sat on the porch that evening, watching the sky melt from pale lavender to deep navy, and we talked, not about the past, not about regrets or timelines or missed chances, but about what it means to live in a way that's honest, even when it costs you people who were never truly paying attention. He didn't ask why I left. He didn't have to. He understood in that quiet way that some people just do, when they've also had to walk away from things they were told they should be grateful for. And that's when I realized something. I wasn't just reclaiming my time, my space, or my voice. I was building a life where I no longer had to explain myself to people who didn't really want to understand. A life where revenge didn't mean hurting them, it meant healing me. And healing, I was learning, looked a lot like choosing silence over explanation. Like sipping hot cider under a wool blanket while the world kept spinning madly without me. Like watching someone from your past step back into your present and realizing that maybe the version of you who walked away all those years ago wasn't running from failure, but towards freedom. They would never see it that way, of course. The family would spin their stories, as they always had. I was being dramatic. I was having a midlife moment. I was running away instead of facing things. But they were wrong. I wasn't running. I was standing still for the first time in my life. And that porch, with its cracked wood planks and uneven nails, and the sound of wind moving through the trees like a whisper I'd waited years to hear, that porch felt more like home than any house I'd ever been invited into. And I hadn't even started yet. It happened the way these things always seem to, suddenly, yet somehow completely predictable, like a thunderstorm you knew was coming because of the weight in the air. The kind of weight that settles in your bones and tells you before you see the first cloud that something's about to break. I hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since the phone call with Ryan, hadn't replied to the string of unanswered texts that continued to pile up like unopened bills, each one full of guilt, confusion, thinly veiled resentment, and, beneath it all, a kind of desperate curiosity that only blossoms when people realize they're losing the narrative they've always controlled. I knew they couldn't stand the silence, not just the absence of my voice, but the absence of my role in the family ecosystem, because without me there to smooth things over, keep the peace, absorb the small cruelties, and smile through them like they were love, the balance was off, and people don't like when the person they quietly depended on stops cooperating. I should have expected the visit, should have known that the moment I stopped playing the part of the reliable, invisible daughter and started living on my own terms, someone would show up under the pretense of concern, but carrying something much heavier: entitlement, confusion, and a silent demand to be let back in, not because they missed me, but because my absence made them uncomfortable in a way they didn't know how to name. It was late morning when they pulled up, two sets of tires crunching over the gravel drive, the sound jarring against the quiet rhythm of the woods. I watched them from the kitchen window without moving, the red SUV I recognized immediately as Mom's, and behind it, Ryan's sleek black car that always looked like it belonged to someone younger, someone still trying to prove something. They didn't knock at first. They stood by the cars, hands on hips, looking around like they were inspecting a property they might be interested in buying, and for a fleeting, bitter second I wondered if they thought that's what this was, some phase I'd outgrow. Some tantrum they could talk me out of if they just used the right combination of pity and performance. When the knock finally came, I didn't answer right away. I wanted them to feel the waiting, the not knowing, the hesitation they'd trained me to live in for so many years. And when I finally opened the door, barefoot and holding a mug of tea, I didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't fill the silence with pleasantries. I just looked at them, watched them watch me, and waited. Mom was the first to speak, of course, always the self-appointed voice of the family, and she opened her mouth with a shaky inhale like she was preparing to deliver a monologue, but instead, what came out was a brittle attempt at control masked as affection. "Well, this is nice," she said, stepping inside uninvited, eyes scanning the cabin as if to assess its worth, as if she needed to see where, exactly, her daughter had chosen to disappear to. "Very rustic. I didn't know you were into this kind of thing." Ryan followed behind, silent but tense, his eyes narrowed not in concern but in calculation, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted to. I let them enter. I didn't offer them tea or ask them to sit down. I didn't even close the door. I let the cold follow them in. For a few minutes, the conversation danced around the obvious. How had I found this place? How long had I been here? Was it safe being alone? Didn't I miss everyone? Wasn't I worried people would think I'd lost my mind? And I answered none of it directly. I let their questions hang in the air like laundry on a line that no one remembered to take down before the rain. Finally, Ryan said what I knew he'd been waiting to say since the moment they stepped out of the car. "Is this about Dad?" he asked, and his voice had that edge it always did when he knew there was a piece of the story he didn't have and couldn't get without admitting he'd never paid attention. And that was the moment. The one I'd been waiting for. I walked to the bookshelf near the window, pulled down a small leather envelope, and handed it to him without speaking. Inside was a photo, one I'd taken with an old disposable camera I found at the back of a drawer. The kind of photo you don't plan to share, but keep because it holds something more real than anything staged. It was me and Dad, sitting on the porch of the cabin in the early days of his diagnosis, before the decline, before the hospital visits and the quiet death that Mom refused to talk about until it became convenient to mention again. He was laughing, holding a mug, the same mug I used that morning. That photo had never been seen by anyone else. Until now. Ryan looked at it, then at me, and his expression shifted, not to guilt, not to sorrow, but to something deeper and more disorienting. Confusion. Because he had no memory of this moment. He didn't know Dad had ever been here. He didn't know that when Dad was sick and fading, this was where he wanted to go, not the beach house, not Ryan's fancy condo, not some sterile hospice bed in the city, but here. With me. In this place. In silence. In peace. This was his cabin, I said quietly. He bought it before he died. Left it to me. No one else knew. Not even Mom. He said it was the only place he ever really felt like himself. The silence that followed was not the angry kind, not the defensive kind, but the hollow, echoing kind that happens when something inside a person rearranges and they don't yet know how to respond. Mom looked away, her face pale. Ryan held the photo like it was a foreign object. I think you should go now, I said, not cruelly, not with bitterness, but with finality. They left without argument. Later that night, I sat on the balcony, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring out at the dark, frozen lake. A new snowfall had started, light and powdery, just enough to make the world look soft again. My phone buzzed once, an unknown number, probably someone from the family trying to reach out again, but I let it buzz. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. Because the truth is, there's a silence more powerful than any scream, a space more honest than any explanation, and a kind of peace that only arrives when you stop trying to make other people understand something they were never willing to see in the first place. Maybe they'll say I disappeared. Maybe they'll say I snapped. Maybe they'll build their own version of the story and pass it around like a family heirloom, polished and false. Let them. I never needed the party. I just needed the porch.